All right, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Comes to us all the way from the state of Virginia. John Hewa is going to be our next speaker, going to be talking about how to prepare our distribution systems for the electric vehicle onslaught that we hear that we're going to get. But this was a segment that I will just tell you, the best ideas for these conferences come from all of you, and so many of you attended the directors conference and heard John talk about this topic out there and came back to me and said, hey, the rest of our folks in Ohio need to hear this. And so please keep those ideas coming. It really does help us put together a quality program. John is Rappahannock Electric Cooperatives president and CEO. He has more than 20 years of leadership experience in the electric utility industry and served as the CEO of Electric Cooperatives in Texas and Florida and now Virginia. He also served as NREC's Vice President of Research, Engineering, and Technical Services. He has a variety of industry-related board experience, including being on the director with the Old Dominion Electric Cooperative and the Virginia, Maryland, Delaware Association of Electric Cooperatives, their statewide association. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering degree and a Master's of Science in Engineering and Management from the University of Tennessee, a doctorate in engineering management from GW University, and is a licensed professional engineer. So please give an Ohio welcome to John Hewa, please.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, good luck, yeah.
Thank you, Doug, and really wonderful to be here, Pat. Really thank you for the opportunity to be here and spend some time with the Ohio Electric Cooperatives. I am John Hewa, the CEO at Rappahannock Electric, and I just want, first of all, glad that some of you heard this presentation or aspects of it. So it may be a little repetitive for you, but hopefully there'll be enough folks in the room that haven't heard it that can get some benefit, and if it is redundant for anybody, hopefully there's a new insight. First of all, let me just say thank you for the partnership between the Virginia, Maryland, Delaware co-ops and the cooperative family here in Ohio. Thank you for sending crews and resources our way ever so frequently, especially in 2022, as our last year kicked off with some of our record storms. So we've had a little bit quieter, slightly quieter 2023, but as I've talked to many folks, sales are down, challenges are up, and it's complex in the leadership teams, and it's complex in the boardrooms, and I'm hoping that I can share a little bit of perspective to help kind of peer through some of that. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, just introduce you to Rappahannock Electric, a few of our affiliates, then I want to spend just a little bit of time on capacity at the PJM level. I won't get into too much. I know you've got a PJM presenter later in the afternoon. And then I want to talk about aging infrastructure and then what we're doing at Rappahannock. Now, everything I'm sharing with you, none of it's prescriptive. This is our approach. We have more questions than we have answers. There is no doubt about that. The more studying we've done, the more it's opened our eyes to questions. So I'm hopeful I can just impart upon you the need for a plan and what we're doing at our co-op and how that might benefit. So with that, we've got the slides up and we'll jump right in. Our service territory, we're about 4,200 square miles. We're this nice diagonal slice across the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we kind of separate NOVA, Northern Virginia, from ROVA, the rest of Virginia. And that's relevant here because of some of the trends I'm going to speak of. We've got some in-migration to our counties as remote work has allowed people to move out of DC and live in areas where they can have a little more room to spread out, a little better cost of living. I showed the commuter hubs. Those are relevant. You know, we've got folks that are commuting 45, 50 miles into Northern Virginia or the Dulles Corridor, 10, 20-mile commutes into Richmond, and also commuting in and out of Charlottesville. That's relevant from the electric vehicle perspective because of the economies related to those commutes. And then one of the other challenges and opportunities that we're seeing right now is the migration of data centers out of Loudoun County and Prince William County into the southern and more western counties, which is where we serve. So we've got our hands full just about every way you look at it. Just a couple of quick facts that I think are relevant to this presentation. We have about 18,000 miles of power lines, a little over 94,000, about 94,500 distribution transformers. I'll refer back to that later. And we're constructing closer to 3,000 miles of fiber in partnership with a neighboring co-op as well as our backbone project as well. So the last thing on this slide that I think is relevant is that our total utility plant is about $1.2 billion, and I'll refer to a replacement cost of that grid here in a minute. Now, two of our affiliates that I think I just want to mention. First, Brilliant IT. Brilliant is our IT and cybersecurity and data analytics subsidiary. We're operating on a national basis now. My strategy with our board in the boardroom was that we needed to load up the REC team to protect our systems from cyber, principally. And in doing so, we would have really loaded our bench and have just so much talent and strength that not only could we hopefully cover all of our needs, but we could actually leverage that strength to provide support to other co-ops. So we're doing that today in a number of states and helping with cyber and data analytics. Our other affiliate that I'll speak of a little bit, and you'll see a video towards the end of my presentation, is Vividly Brighter. So if you think of Brilliant, think of our national brand for IT and analytics. If you think of Vividly Brighter, think of our local, regional, consumer, member, owner facing, but not limited to our service territory, brand with respect to energy services. And so we wanted to position ourselves to be able to be all that we need to be for members over the next several years. With that, my belief is that we're going to need every last watt to get through the EV wave. May be different in your service territory, it may hit at different points in times, but our analysis shows that we're going to need every last watt. From base load, traditional, to non-traditional, to resources at the edge of the grid, to be able to control electric vehicle chargers, and to be able to bring energy off peak. So Vividly Brighter is our platform for all things solar, electrical wiring services, which we're already providing, energy efficiency upgrades, which we're already providing, electric vehicle charging stations, which we're installing this summer. Our first public chargers are going in, and our intent is to be the best provider for EV charging for a residence or a business in our service territory. All right, so, and if I get going too fast, I'll stick around afterwards just to recap with anybody that has any offline questions, but just a kind of a quick look at the national trends, right? Baseload retirements. Congratulations on the Cardinal facility and how you all performed during Winter Storm Elliott. I know PJM was pretty harsh with respect to penalties, and it was great to see that your units ran well. There's tremendous renewables investment. The projections today show solar capacity tripling over the period of 2023 to about 2028 timeframe. We know that there are hopes for new technologies like small modular reactors, but they're not here yet. I can tell you in our state, Dominion Energy put SMRs in their resource plan out in the 2033, 2034 timeframe. Many of us are focusing on grid hardening, broadband build-outs, which are sometimes brutally challenging with respect to make-ready. That's us. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the electrification of everything, including EVs. With regard to the Inflation Reduction Act, just a couple of quick things. First of all, this is about a $490 billion spend focused on the electric grid and predominantly clean energy. But a couple of things in there that are relevant for the EV wave. The tax credits have been extended, right? I think everybody's probably aware of that. The $7,500, it's income qualified, but there's a $7,500 tax credit for the purchase of a new electric vehicle. That got extended out to 2032. That act created a secondary market for used EVs with a $4,000 tax credit for that market as well that will bolster that. And I think what it's done is it's provided quite a bit of certainty to the manufacturers that were already heading in that direction, maybe faster than we would have liked. So from a kind of a capacity perspective, when we've read about electric vehicles, almost all of the focus, in my opinion anyway, has been on capacity and transmission. And I've tracked this for the last few years, and there's been a lot of different perspectives. There are some entities and agencies saying the grid is ready. I don't think so. There are others saying we have enough generation. I don't think so. There are others saying we have enough transmission. I don't think so. And there are others saying that the distribution grid is going to get benefit from EVs. And so the perspectives are all over the map. I think this group in this room probably has a much more pragmatic, real perspective on exactly what the grid and our capacity systems can do for us. The perspectives range all the way out to, could EVs save the grid? Well, yeah, there might be a case where a Ford F-150 can power a home or a school bus can put reverse flow on the grid, but I think these kinds of headlines are dramatically overlooking the realities of the energy flows that our grid has to hold up to make EVs work. And where we have turned the attention now to the distribution grid, I was glad to see that. The Wall Street Journal back in, I believe it was February, finally, in my opinion, came out with an article that started to turn the attention to the electric grid, the local distribution grid, what you all are owners and operators of. Now, the challenge here is that the article is, the consensus is that the utilities can generate enough electricity. I'm not so sure that that's a consensus, but the problem is going to be getting it to the local homes and businesses. While I was glad to see the local grid focus, I don't think there's a consensus. When I talk to generation owners, I'm not hearing anyone talk about having ample capacity for this much addition. When I talk to transmission owners, it's very difficult to get projects cited, to go through the public process and to get those lines built, not much less the cost that we're seeing as the transmission cost increases in PJM. And then when it comes to local distribution network, we're going to dive into that here in this presentation. So just a quick bit about the PJM landscape. And again, you're going to hear from PJM a little bit later, but I summarize it in 4 charts. First, the load forecast. PJM is achieving about 150,000 megawatt load across its 13 states, 65 million consumers. The forecasts show dramatic increase up to 175, nearly 180,000 megawatts, with a new line, that black dotted line in the upper left chart, is showing the data center load, which is roughly at least a 10,000 megawatt addition by the end of the decade. I believe it's going to be much higher than that. While PJM is showing kind of a base load or baseline projection, they're also now showing an electrification. But I too believe that may be understated with regard to how much energy and demand electric vehicles are going to put onto the grid. If you look at the retirements, we've had 40,000 megawatts, 40 gigawatts, 40,000 megawatts of retirements over the last decade. And if you look at anticipated retirements, we've got over 20,000, mostly policy-driven retirements between now and the end of this decade out at 2030. So my 4-slide summary for PJM is in the lower right-hand corner. The energy transition in PJM looks alarming. 21, 22% reserves today, which are still touch and go during times like Elliott and in other events. By the end of the decade, those projections are down to 3 to 5%. And if we have a high new entry, a new approach to new capacity, we might be able to keep those reserves just above the 10% level. So having spent some time in ERCOT, and I left ERCOT before Winter Storm Uri hit out there, but the debate out there was around 12 and 14% reserve margins, and we've seen what happened in a tough situation out there, in an Arctic blast that took out most or much of the grid, that generation and transmission and distribution co-ops had to pay dearly, and are in some cases having to securitize that on the backs of their membership for the next 20 or even 30 years in some cases, the cost of just 2 or 3 days in the market. So I am concerned about the kind of the capacity outlook for PJM, and I think that between the data center load that's inbound and this EV wave, we've got to be really focused on this at all different levels. Okay, so now let's jump into the local grid. What are we doing at REC? So I really got the culmination of a couple of different studies here. I've been in the CEO role at Rappahannock for 3 years. I was there for 3 years prior to that as well. But the first thing that I wanted to get kind of my arms around with our board of directors was the age of our infrastructure. Years back in 2010 timeframe, we acquired part of an investor-owned utility. In doing so, we, at that point, took on a lot of 55,000 additional accounts, a lot of new assets. We had kind of a mixture of different construction standards. And one of the things that I wanted us to do was conduct a system aging study. So we looked at poles, transformers, overhead and underground, conductor, and we took all these different classes of equipment, and we just kind of took a step back and did an aging analysis of our grid to say, are we replacing enough equipment, enough materials in the field? Is our turnover adequate? What is the age of our infrastructure? What was it designed for? And what can it tolerate? We also did a kind of a recast of what a replacement grid would cost. And that cost, this is 2021 pricing. This is before a lot of the supply chain inflation that we've seen. Our 2021 pricing recast our grid at well over $3 billion. So $1.2 billion in utility plant today. A like-for-like replacement of that was estimated with construction units at over $3 billion, and that's before a lot of the supply chain strain and some of the inflation we've seen even in the last couple of abrupt years here. So that was study one, getting our arms around aging infrastructure. And what it told us was we weren't investing nearly enough, right? We've been pretty aggressive, but we're not investing nearly enough just based on the design life of the poles and the conductor and those types of things. With that, we conducted a system hardening and resilience study. Our grid's getting hit with more and more storms. Our members have higher and higher expectations. We're struggling to keep our SAIDI and our reliability numbers where we want them to be, so we wanted to kind of take a look at what should we start to build for the future. And with that, we adopted much more stringent construction design standards. And this may sound familiar. Some of you may have done something similar, but we basically went to a Class 3 construction, which is a pretty significant wood pole structure, 40 and 45 minimums on that. We adopted extensive use of fiberglass arms for more strength, additional down guying, and really getting our grid ready for withstanding storms and additional capacities. This is relevant because it fits into the EV discussion. Now, one last bit before I leave aging infrastructure is how bad was it? Well, or how bad is it? The gray line in the middle, the gray region of this chart, indicates about a 55 to about 70-year lifespan of infrastructure. And the blue star is more indicative of what we were spending on an annualized basis. We were, even though our capital plans had grown to historic levels, 24 to 25 million a year just on system turnover. And what our study told us, and told our organization, our board of directors, is that we needed to practically double that. We needed to be more in the $45 to $55 million per year range just on basic system turnover, overhead and underground combined. So that's a huge challenge. A couple of things we did, or that we're doing. One, we backed off of some generosity on line extensions. As much as I hated to do that, we were putting too much capital out for new line extensions. So we backed off of some of that to preserve some capital and push that over into replacements. Second, the investments in fiber and the make-ready. It's been some wind in our sails, so to speak. We've gotten a lot of lift out of make-ready, some shared cost relationships we have with ISPs, and benefiting from some of the federal dollars, whether it was the FCC RDOF or some of the other dollars that went into getting fiber stimulated, we're now benefiting from that, and we're getting kind of a lift there. But before you run headlong into aging infrastructure and hardening your grid, you got to take a little bit of a pause and say, well, what am I designing for the future? Is it like for like? Is it old pole comes out, new pole goes in? Is it, the next work plan is just your standard conductor? Or is there something more significant afoot here that we need to get our arms around? And that's where we went with this EV conversation in our analysis. So if you take a look, and I didn't notice a lot of EVs in the parking lot. I will tell you, you go look around Richmond and some of our areas, we're starting to see a lot. On I-95, I-66, we're seeing a lot of EVs through and in our service territory. But regardless of whether you're kind of an EV skeptic or maybe an EV enthusiast, we've got to have our eyes open with regard to what's happening with the manufacturers and where public policy is pushing this. And it doesn't seem to matter what the grid was designed for or what the grid was even capable. In fact, I'm not even sure anyone's even asked us, really. I know NRECA has been vocal on this, and APPA and EEI, but I'm not sure that some of our policymakers have even taken the notion to ask us, what could the grid handle and under what conditions, and what can we do truly from a generation, transmission, and local grid perspective. So if you're following the forecast, you'll see that most of the U.S. forecasts indicate sales equality or sales supremacy by 2033. That was about a year ago, that headline. That's actually been sped up a little bit. I've seen some forecasts that indicate that equilibrium or parity, if you will, could be reached by 2030, 2031 even, possibly a couple of years earlier. This past year, we saw around 6%, or I think it was 6.5 or so percent EV sales in the United States. This first quarter of 2023 was, I think, 7.7, 7.8% of all new sales were electric vehicles. And so whether you're planning to have one in your utility fleet or in your driveway, I think we owe it to our member consumers, and we owe it to the grid that we've been leaning on for decades. We owe it to that to take a look at what this could mean for our co-ops. Now, if you're betting against EVs, one, we'd have to see a pretty dramatic shift in public policy. Not saying that won't happen. I'm just saying the current path we're on, sales incentives, incentives for new vehicles, incentives for manufacturers, the current path we're on is just simply not that trajectory. This chart shows where the key manufacturers will be by various years with regard to electrification. And the blue on the chart is fully electrified, right? Fully electric. And so if you look at it about the year 2028, 2029, Ford is at what, 50% fully electric? By 2030, you've got Volvo, right? Mercedes-Benz, VW, GM out at 2035. It's a pretty significant bet. This doesn't include Rivian, Tesla, and all the others that are, inherently electric. So it's a pretty significant bet to go against the investment that's being poured into those manufacturers. Over $600 billion globally is already being and is projected to be poured into the EV transition. The Southeast United States is a pretty significant beneficiary of that. I think particularly in the Southeast, right? We've got battery facilities right here in Ohio, definitely in the Blue Oval facility in Kentucky. Tennessee's had several, South Carolina. I know they're shopping, Virginia. So there's been a lot of investment. The manufacturers are clearly driving to this point, and my fear is that they're getting all the way in on this before some of the realities of the grid start to surface, and particularly the local distribution grid. Now, if you're not up on kind of the pricing and some of the energy cost, here's a quick look of a couple of potentially popular. I'm seeing a lot of those VW ID4s. I'm already seeing those on the road. The Silverados are much anticipated. I think the F-150 Lightning was interesting but underwhelming to a lot of people. The Silverado is coming out at 400 miles range with stronger towing capacity. The Dodge Ram Revolution is just, I think, 12 months behind that, promising 500 miles range, and according to their CEO, quote, no performance degradation. So we'll see. We'll see how our members take to light-duty trucks. And I don't think the F-150 is necessarily the right benchmark for that. I think we're going to see this, leapfrog mentality. Ford, General Motors, Dodge. We're going to see them like they've done with the displacement and horsepower and features in traditional vehicles. We're going to see the same thing with respect to EVs. But what I want to draw your attention to are the implications on energy consumption. So we took our average consumption, which is about 1,300 kilowatt hours a month annualized, And for that residential member on the Rappahannock grid, if they buy one sedan, right, one sedan, maybe that ID4, that's probably even a little bigger, but if they buy one sedan and charge it 77% at home, and they drive 20,000 miles a year, which is not uncommon, particularly in these commuter hubs, it's a 30% increase in energy consumption. If you roll that to a minivan, we're almost to 40%, and a light-duty truck, an F-150, a Silverado, the kinds of things that our members drive a lot of, a Tahoe, those types of things, is a whopping 50%, 50% increase we project in energy consumption on an annualized basis. Number one, power bills are going to go up. Number two, a lot more dependency on reliability and getting the lights back on. And then I guess the third question is, are the savings really there once we start to invest everything into the grid that we truly have to spend to keep up with this wave? So for charging, why are we talking so much about kind of the consumption and the demands here? Well, if you look at a typical residential consumption, and I believe these charts will probably be available, but again, glad to share these with anybody that wants a copy. Think of a hairdryer at 1.5 kW, 1,500 watts, right? A microwave, hairdryer, those types of things, an iron. A level 2 charger out there in the orange, second to the right, is pretty typical at a 7 kW charge rate. That would be like a Hyundai or maybe a Tesla sedan, right? Look at the F-150. And I don't know where we're going to be with the Silverado, but look at the F-150, the 19.2, the level 2 charger for the F-150 is 19 kW. Right. Most of us designed the grid for 6 to 8 kW for the whole house. Maybe if it's on a heat pump with electric resistance heat, maybe it spikes in the winter. But we're now talking about not just a little step on an appliance, we're talking about a different ball game. When we get to the level of light-duty trucks, we're talking about a totally different ball game. The Silverado is 8,000 pounds with 400 miles of range, and so the vehicles are very heavy. Lithium-ion is the technology of the day, and until there's some technology breakthrough, and by the way, all the manufacturing dollars is lithium-ion, all the plants that are being invested in, that's lithium-ion. Until there's a breakthrough, the name of the game is bigger batteries for longer range, for heavier vehicles, so they can compete with the gasoline engine. But what that does to the grid is it means you gotta force more energy into the battery faster, right? You've got to have the ability, and that's where the wattage, the kW, the wattage increases so dramatically. Now, to put this in perspective, a typical pole top transformer, single home, might be a 15 kVA, basically a 15 kW. Now, they can operate a little above their nameplate, but right at the surface, you can kind of imagine that if you were serving a single family home in rural America, and you've had a transformer out there for the last 20 years, and it's good to go for the next 40 years probably, and it's a 15 kVA transformer, you might have a problem if they're layering in a light-duty truck. And they're probably going to be layering in a light-duty truck, especially if that's the only vehicle they can buy in 2033, 2034, 2035, right? So we've got a problem right there, right at the surface. This doesn't even begin to touch a Tesla sedan is capable of charging in the 150 to 250 kW range. One of our team members at the co-op, we had an all-day workshop, a whole day workshop with our board on electric vehicles and our grid. We went through all of our studies. We also had done a whole nother day workshop previously on aging infrastructure. But we had a screenshot from one of our team members, and his vehicle was pulling 149 kW. It's a sedan, I guess 5 seats, right? But probably 4 comfortably. That's as much energy as an elementary school in April, right? I mean, 149 kW for one vehicle. So you got to start to look, and that's not an F-150, right? Or that's not a Tesla. It was a Tesla, but it's not at a 250 kW. the layers of implications for our commercial accounts, for what our traditional gas stations today, or the load that a Walmart might take on, not even to mention, one of the things in our region is distribution centers. We've seen distribution centers, like a Dollar General or something, we've seen distribution facilities that, used to be 2 to 4, maybe 4 or 5 megawatts. Now, with the potential for electric fleets and trucks road to road to road charging, those are 15 to 20 kW or a megawatt, 15 to 20 megawatt loads, a 4 or 5 times increase, even at the C&I level. So again, all this is strain back on the grid. The grid's done a great job, but it wasn't exactly designed for this. So what did we do at our co-op? And okay, I'm glad we got the timer going because it wasn't running there a minute ago, so I'm back on time here. But what do we do at our co-op around EVs? Okay, you saw the aging infrastructure study to say, how much do we need to be replacing? You saw the system hardening, what do we need to replace it with? Then we take a pause and we say, what does it really look like for EVs? We took an adoption of technology and we did a zip code level analysis. We used a national consultant, Burns & McDonnell, to do this. And the reason I used a national consultant was because I knew of the spend that's affiliated with this. I wanted to be able to help justify with our commission and even our policymakers in Virginia to be able to talk to them. This isn't just what John thinks. It is what John thinks, but it's also what a national consulting firm has computed. We did a zip code adoption for our grid. And yours would look different, but my point here is it may be time to start coming up with the plan, right? So what's interesting about this, the whole range of this chart, it's only from 2022 to 2040. This is only 18 years. We've been doing this for 70, 80 years, some of us, not personally, but our companies have, right? So there's only 18 years on this chart, and what I want you to gain from this is how steep we think the curve or the wave is. That vertical line is the year 2030. We have a high, a medium, and a low projection. And on the low, we could see as few as 16,000 electric vehicles. I know we already have at least a few thousand, right? We'd already tracked around the 3,000 level. And that's a couple of years ago. I think we're at least medium at around 37,000 vehicles. And at a high adoption, we could see up to 93,000 EVs on our grid. But what's kind of scary about it is the red line. Let's say you buy into the study, but you're a little skeptical. Well, okay, there's only 5 years difference between the low and the high. In other words, the low projection actually equals the 2030 high by 2034, 2035. The wave is moving so fast. Keep in mind, by 2035, General Motors says they aren't even going to manufacture a vehicle that isn't all electric. I'm not saying that won't change. I'm just saying that's what they're telling the world. That's what they're telling investors. That's what they're telling lawmakers. So we did a couple of things. One, we did analysis of our circuits from the substation looking down. The other thing we did analysis of all of our transformers from the consumer looking back up. I'll talk to you first about this first analysis. And we did this for several different substations and several different circuits. Some were entirely rural. Some were pretty dense and packed in and kind of suburban. This one's kind of a hybrid. If any of you have ever gone up I-95 from Richmond or coming from the Carolinas up towards DC, this is Lee's Hill, and this is right where the traffic becomes the worst nightmare in the world on I-95 as you're going north. That's where this is, okay? So you may not have ever seen it on a map, but if you've driven through there, you knew it because you saw nothing but brake lights as you tried to push north on I-95. We took our existing circuits. We didn't add any native load. We didn't add a Walgreens. We didn't add a swimming pool in anybody's backyard. We didn't add any other appliance. We just took our grid and we modeled it in the year 2030. And we didn't model it to full penetration of EVs because we figured nobody'd listen to us, right? So we took the year 2030 and said, what do we think could happen in 2030? And at our high projection, which we believe could happen in 2030, and no later than 2035, we had about a 40% adoption. Now, that's not 40% of all vehicles. That's 40% of our accounts, 40% of our residentials having one EV in the driveway by the year 2030. Maybe that's ahead of, maybe that's a little aggressive. Maybe that's 5 years later. It isn't going to matter because we weren't going to rebuild the whole grid in those 5 years anyway. It's still the same grid. So in the year 2030 at 40% adoption, we had about a 65% sedans and about a 35% light-duty trucks. Actually, Americans buy just the opposite of that. So we were pretty conservative. We said mostly sedans, not so much on the light-duty trucks. We modeled this two different ways. We modeled it with everyone playing nicely and kind of a managed charging, where we send out savvy rates and members are listening to us and they're charging only at the right hours of the day and they're not hitting the summer peak and they're not hitting the winter peak and everybody's cooperating. And in that case, that one circuit, the remediation was over $700,000. Now, this is the point where I should tell you we have over 100 substations and well over 300 circuits. So $700,000 for one circuit's a big problem. What if members aren't cooperating with us? What if it's like Winter Storm Elliott? Gee, right before a holiday weekend, kind of hitting on a Thursday, Friday, it's colder than anyone projected, single digits in some cases. Everybody's traveling. People start to get nervous about whether they've got enough fuel. I mean, what happens when there's a storm today? The grocery store is packed. Everyone is buying milk, bread, Kit Kats, M&Ms, all those things you've got to have to get through the storm, right? What do we think is going to happen in the face of a storm, especially around Thanksgiving or just like Elliott on Christmas Eve and the day prior? If we don't have the diversity in the charging, what happens if everyone's charging up, right? 4th of July weekend, that type of thing. So at 40% adoption, without the diversity of charging, it's a meltdown. Our grid, it's done. This is the year 2030, maybe I'm off a few years, 40% adoption, everyone's charging near or on peak, lights out. It ain't gonna make it. It's not even close. And in fact, the remediation for that is so substantial. It involves different operating voltages, right? For any of you that are in the kind of the operations side, well, that means everything changes. All the cable, all the transformers, everything changes, right? If you have to up the voltage, like literally a different class of voltage for your underground systems. Much bigger conductor, which required much bigger conduit that we didn't put in the ground. It requires bigger conductor on the overhead grid, which we didn't plan for back in the day. You can see right now, we could easily be upside down on transformer loading. Now, you say, okay, John, I'm not believing the time frames. Here's the other interesting thing about 40%. Just go to 2040, go way out and say, okay, let's say everybody's driving EVs. What's the best we could ever do on managed charging? Well, we'd be lucky that day to only have 40% of them on the grid. So this is kind of a look at a worst case for 2030, but it's almost like a best case for 2040, right? I mean, if everyone had EVs and we could keep 60% of them off the peak, we'd be declaring victory. The grid still, right, it's still not even close. And this is almost $3 million for remediation. This is 2021 pricing. It probably is $3 million with today's pricing just for that one circuit. And so we got a big problem. Now, one of the things we're looking at is the non-traditional approach. I said earlier, I think we're gonna need every last watt. Every power plant we can keep in service, every transmission line we can get built. Start thinking about new design standards today on your grid, because a like-for-like replacement might be stranded, right? It might not be big enough, even though it needs to be replaced today because of age. In a decade from now, you've got a brand new facility, maybe it's a wood pole that could last 50 or 60 years, but if you put that in tomorrow and it's not adequate for the EV load, you're gonna be spending additional money. We're studying right now kind of the non-traditional approach. Can you finesse it, right? I mean, so if you're my board and I'm saying, well, we've got 300 circuits and some of them look like this and it's $3 million, your next question, well, first question is who's going to pay for it? The next question is, what else can you do? Well, we're looking at what else can we do, and I come from the day and the time where it was bulk construction, bulk delivery, bulk power generation, and it's worked, right? 4 nines of reliability. Our numbers aren't quite that high, but some of you probably have that. And the grid's been hard to beat economically, and it's hard to beat in terms of reliability. And where we've had challenges, we can layer in some of these technologies. We are looking at, since we can't exactly afford to wholesale replace all of our circuits in the next 10 years, what does it look like if we layer in other assets? Can storage help us get there? Can some solar on the edge help us get there? I can tell you one thing, with Vividly Brighter, we absolutely want to control every electric charger on the grid. We want to control every single charger that goes on our grid. I mentioned we have 94,500 transformers in operation. The other thing we did was we studied them from the consumer up, and our question was this: what happens if somebody gets excited, and they go out for Labor Day weekend and they buy that, their neighbor bought an EV and they get excited and they buy an EV, and they don't call us, because why would they? And the salesperson doesn't say anything about, hey, you better check with your utility to make sure they got capacity. That conversation isn't going to happen. They're going to say, sign here, take the vehicle, have fun, turn the radio on. What happens, right? So we looked at all 94,000 transformers and we modeled them if they had an EV tomorrow on the summer peak or on the winter peak. Two things: 64% of our transformers would be over nameplate. That's not necessarily the end of the world. They can operate over nameplate. The question is, how much over nameplate? And 25% of our transformers, even without an EV, are already hitting above nameplate for either summer or winter. The winter peak is a lot more forgiving because it's cold. The summer peak isn't very forgiving. So my point is, we're trying to get our arms around what happens, what's the consumer experience tomorrow. I can tell you the first few F-150s have been bought that we're aware of by our members, and we had to replace the transformer. That should be no surprise to anybody. One last thing on kind of developments before I kind of start to close here. Be careful on subdivisions, because you're probably leveraging the developer to pay for much of the infrastructure, the conduit, the cables, the transformers. Well, that's kind of the toughest pinch point, right? The overhead grid, you got some more, it's a little more forgiving, you got some flexibility, but on the subdivisions, that's where it really gets tough. And if your neighbors start buying an EV and the next neighbor gets excited and they say, hey, I'm going to get the same thing, and you can see where that can run away pretty quickly. The cost to design a 300-home subdivision today for us, $560,000, $600,000 range is the installed, everything put in at once, if we actually installed all of it. And that's kind of a typical install today. The problem is, what would you build that for today if you knew EVs were going to be everywhere? If you knew that by 2040, it'd be 100% EVs, right? That's a very, very, very different design. It's a much more expensive design, and it's a really potentially almost impossible conversation to have today with the developer. So again, this is where I told you we got more questions than we have answers. We're working to get our arms around, we don't want our next subdivision to be installed, the developer walks away, and then 9 years later, we have to rebuild it, right? We can't, our members can't afford even to replace that, right? So a couple of quick kind of high-level facts where the conversation is getting going. First of all, EEI indicates there could be 26 million EVs by 2030, which is a dramatic increase of where we are today. Residential EV charging can push consumption or demand up by 70 to 130%. This one I liked. The Boston Consulting Group, this is in that Wall Street Journal article I had up earlier, was, I think, one of the first studies that kind of started sounding like they were actually thinking the way we're thinking, indicated the local distribution network, that's us, right? Minus the G&T folks, right? But that's most of us, right? The local distribution network might need to spend $1,700 to $5,800 per EV sold between now and 2030. At Rappahannock, if you take our number, that's $500 million. Now, there's a lot of revenue, right? Their power bills are going up 30 to 50%. But that's a lot of money. That's a lot of expense that's very difficult in this supply chain constrained world that we're in right now. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is a vastly new grid. We are working on some EV grid maturity levels. This is not the kind of thing that you can just turn into overnight. And there needs to be some milestones, like some check-in points along the way, like has public policy, continued? Are the manufacturers holding to their projections and proclamations about how electrified they will be and by what year? But basically, to kind of stack it up here, the logic for us is around kind of an EV0 to an EVG0 to an EVG3, and it's really looking at kind of a baseline, above the RUS minimums, which is probably the minimum that any of you are building to. In 2021, we had already adopted hardened standards. So we kind of put that as our EV0, right? Heavier construction, taller poles, ability to add bigger cables later. An EVG1, for instance, and we're looking at that in the immediate future. In fact, we're working right now basically to not order 15 kVA transformers anymore, right? And our pad mounts, we're not ordering 25s. We are in a state now where we realize that even one EV pushes that. So we're already looking at our future distribution transformers setting a new minimum floor, which will drive the cost up, which will be borne by our members, which will be covered by developers, right? So there's some inflation to this. An EVG2 out towards getting towards the latter parts of the decade. Again, these years could slip, and hopefully they will a little bit in terms of how fast things are happening, but we need to be prepared that they might happen this quick. And having visibility of the grid way beyond like our SCADA systems, way beyond what we can see today, but actually a distribution management system where we can actually see the grid and know that a problem is about to occur, and then throttle down those EV chargers. So this is what we're envisioning. We haven't built our full model, but it's the directions that we're heading in. And I'll share just a little bit now. Oops. Oh, sorry. I think you're one slide too soon. Just as I close out on Vividly Brighter, Vividly Brighter Charging is our local regional brand for charging and installing chargers with our members. Vividly Brighter Solar, we believe, can help on the edge of the grid. We need every bit of G&T resource. We do not need to keep retiring power plants at all. We need more baseload capacity, period. I mean, we need all of those resources to be there. But we are also going to need every watt at the edge, and I think we got to be ready for that. So I'll go with the video here. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I don't know if we have time for even one or two questions, maybe just a few questions, right?
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. We have a little cushion built into our lunch break, so are there any questions?
I think you've got one back there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wouldn't any EV home charging station or the proposed charging network that they're talking about, wouldn't that benefit from having significant battery backup for each facility?
Absolutely. You know, that's that analysis we're going through right now. Our first pass was to say, how would we rebuild the subdivision or the circuit today? And it's kind of the bulk approach, bigger wire, bigger cable, bigger poles, bigger transformers. What we're studying now is, can we kind of finesse it, right? How far can we get if we have storage programs and things that match up that start to, you know, a community level, or even behind the meter and community level storage that could help us ride through that peak. So we're studying that. You know, I spent actually a lot of time studying battery energy storage in PJM. I spent a couple of years studying battery energy storage. One of the challenges is you better be right on dispatch, right? Because sometimes the peak moves, sometimes the peak's longer. We're talking usually, if it's utility scale, 2-hour, 4-hour, maybe 8-hour batteries, but usually it's 2-hour and 4-hour. And so you've got to be right on dispatch, because if you exhaust the battery, you know, then you don't have that traditional dispatchable base load to back it up. But great question. Yeah.
Morning. It sounded like one of your comments was leaning in this direction, but is there talk of, in your circles, about the marriage of coal-fired along with solar and green energy working together, as opposed to this is our camp, that's your camp? So I think you know where I'm going. Thank you.
Great question. I've been disappointed from a policy perspective of the lack of, first of all, the lack of recognition that solar and intermittent resources have grown up leaning on the grid. I mean, that reserve margin that's shrinking in PJM, that reserve margin is what has allowed the additional resources into the mix. And from that perspective, that's a good thing that's allowed those resources, but we seem to not understand that those resources have to continue to exist. And you know, as you look at the PJM, and you'll hear, I'm sure, a much more eloquent presentation this afternoon on PJM, but when I was in our ODEC boardroom at Old Dominion and we were talking about our future outlook on pricing, and we were talking about hedging it against what's the natural gas price, and I kind of waved my hand and I said, I think we need to hedge, I think we have to index against scarcity. I don't know that we can index if, in Virginia, we can't build a natural gas facility. And so PJM, the predominance of the resources you're seeing going into PJM are wind and solar at this point. So I'm very concerned that our future pricing index would even be natural gas if public policy and the laws in the various states are not enabling that. So I think there's a whole lot more that should be done between coal, gas, solar, and wind, and even the bridge with storage. But it seems too much of one camp versus the other, and not a, hey, we're actually codependent. Yeah.
Time for one more question. Okay. You see the way? Okay, hang on.
You said you want to control the EVs. Do you have a plan on how that's going to, I mean, is that through price, or do you have a plan on how you're going to do that? And also, you had a generator program. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure thing. Great question. So we do have an EV pilot rate. We have about 400 members right now that are in, and we're Virginia's first co-op EV rate. It's a little oversimplified. We have smart hours where they can charge, and we provide a $7 monthly credit, which is about 100 miles of driving. So it's actually kind of value. It's pretty notable to them. So we've had good enrollment for that program, but we don't have really full dynamic pricing. We're basically capturing the PJM demand peaks, and we're working to show that as a credit for a member that will come off peak with their charging. It's working. We know that program will have to mature even further. So that's kind of the first level, is to have some kind of pricing incentive, and also to begin to kind of develop the list of followers regarding EV drivers. But what we really need to drive towards, no pun intended, is more like what's called a DERMS platform, a distribution energy resource management. But it's really a platform that kind of builds a digital twin, if you will, of your grid. It builds a digital version of it, and you're monitoring your metering and your loading, and you know the capacities of your wire. And in that platform, our Vividly Brighter charging, where we're heading, we don't own that platform yet, we're shopping, but in that platform, what we will do with our Vividly Brighter charging is our chargers will have the ability to be throttled, either on, off, or just to bring them down and to bring down the load. And that's the kind of visibility that probably none of us in this room have today. There might be somebody that has that, but by and large, we don't have that much visibility into the grid, and that's the kind of technology that it's available, but it's the kind of investment that most of us probably haven't made yet.
Well, one of the great things about this electric cooperative network is the ability to share information across the network. And John, we certainly appreciate you coming to Ohio.
Thank you.
Sharing your knowledge, experience, your research, everything you shared with us today. So let's give John a round of applause, please. Thank you.